lame, it was embarrassing, it was stingy. This one who we as people of faith, we call the Prince of Peace, they called him the King of Kings. What he received that day was no hero's welcome. Let's think about it for a minute. There was no Air Force One, no chariot, not even a horse that Jesus rode in on. The passage says it was an untamed, untrained donkey that had never been ridden. You see, a horse was only for the wealthy. There was no planning that went into this event, no bands, no trumpets, no hail to the chief. It was an impromptu, ragtag, unrehearsed gathering that first Palm Sunday. There was no red carpet, no flags, no banners. I imagine a couple of guys climbed up into a tree and threw down some branches. They threw their old dirty coats out on the pathway. And this processional wasn't on Broadway, it wasn't on Main Street. Historians tell us that it was likely out on the edge of town, likely on a road that went through a makeshift village of homes made from scraps from the dump. It was a ghetto that Jesus entered that day. There were no dignitaries, there were no super PAC donors, there were no religious or business elite, there was no one of significance there that day. In fact, it was the exact opposite. It was a crowd of the poor and the outcast, those rejected. Some had followed him, it says, from Jericho. These were the folks who lived out in the countryside, those who lived off the land, who lived out in the sticks. These were the uneducated, those in need. You see, folks, this parade that we often talk about called Palm Sunday, it was no hero's welcome. It was a crowd. We might even say it was a mob of peasants and outcasts who were all there in need. Contrary to maybe how we often read this story, I imagine that this story never even made the evening news. I imagine Jesus there entering Jerusalem, the city of the wealthy, the holy, the prosperous, the elite. I imagine Jesus gets angry when he's greeted there by this overwhelming sea of people who had so little in that city that had so much. You see, ancient Jerusalem was the center of commerce and wealth in that ancient society. It was the capital city where politicians and lobbyists made their way around town. It was where Herod's temple was, adorned with gold, and there, right in the middle of this giant city, was the temple, the center of religious life, with all its smells and bells and its priests and fine jewelry and purple clothing, Armani suits, Gucci bags, Rolex watches. Jesus was livid. Jesus was angry because he was surrounded immediately as he entered into that city by so many who were poor and forgotten. And it happened right there in a city of such opulence, with the religious center of their day, the temple right at the center. Jesus, I imagine, went, how can this be? And so he goes straight to the center of life of that community. He goes straight to the temple, our Bible tells us. The center not only of religious life, you see, the temple way back when was also the center of commerce and trade. It was there that the money changers changed money for all those who had come from miles around. You see, they needed the local currency. It was at the temple, we find out in history, where clothes were purchased, food and spices, products were traded. You could buy anything. It was there that people bought animals for sacrifice. And so we hear the story of Jesus there entering the temple. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple, and he began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples, they went out of the city. Folks, when Jesus arrives at the temple, he wasn't surprised that day as he entered Jerusalem that there was all this buying and selling going on in the temple. What he was surprised by is who benefited and who was losing out. You see, it was a place where the poor, the outcast, immigrant, the foreigner, they were taken advantage of. They were easy game. My wife and I had the privilege of traveling to Venice, Italy a while back. And while we were there, we arrived. It was late one evening. We pulled out our Rick Steves guide to find where we were supposed to stay that night. We had made a reservation. We had had nothing to eat all day long, and so we went out with our guidebook. As Americans, that's what you do. You walk around with your guidebook, right? And we found a little restaurant where we could grab a bite to eat. It was late. It was the only place open. And as we sat down at our table there, eventually, reluctantly, this waitress who thought we had gotten there far too late came to our table. And I don't know if she spoke any English, but she was not going to let us on that she spoke English that night. And as we tried to communicate to her, we ended up just sort of shooting out of our mouth whatever we could. And so we said, 2 vino, 1 fish plate. We didn't know any Italian. We couldn't read the menu. And she looked at us and gave us that look, and my wife and I looked at each other and went, this is not going to be good. She went back to the kitchen, and not 2 minutes later, she dropped a plate on our table and 2 glasses of wine, and she stormed away. And when I looked down at that plate and saw the eyeballs of some creature looking back up at me, I knew we had been taken that night. You see, as Jesus climbed the steps to that temple, he was angry because it was there at the temple, the most religious site, that his people were also being taken. They were being taken. And so Jesus, the story tells us, he overturns the tables of those money changers who were the equivalent of payday lenders or crooked mortgage brokers. He turned the tables of those employers who exploited their employees, weren't able to pay them a livable wage. He turned over the tables of those who sold animals at exorbitant prices so people could bring sacrifice. He turned over the tables of those that exploited women and children. He turned over the tables of all those who benefited from keeping the poor poor. You see, on that day way back when in Jerusalem, Jesus wasn't surprised one bit by the buying and selling that was going on there in the temple. He was livid, though. He was livid about the economics. And so if you look in our reading today, you heard Jesus say these words, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." You see, on that holy day so long ago, it wasn't the buying and selling, it was the robbing that got Jesus mad. The economics that allowed the well-to-do to exploit the poor. And folks, I got to let you know that in the end, this turning over of the tables, this makeshift protest Jesus made that day, this is what got Jesus in trouble. He dared to mess with the economics of his day. I imagine those muckety-mucks said, "Jesus, you can start a food shelf. You can build all the houses you want with Habitat for Humanity. You can collect and pack all the food you want for the poor. You can travel around the countryside preaching all you want, but Jesus, don't you dare mess with the economics. You can travel the countryside talking about love and joy and peace and heal all the people you want. You can do all that feel-good stuff, Jesus. That's just fine. But don't mess with our economics. Because Jesus, you know what'll happen. Jesus, you're likely to end up on the cross. Thanks be to God. Amen.